Hello, everyone. Welcome to one of our post-debate analysis for Debatable Open 2024. We are joined today by our motion contributor for the religion motion set, Jill Aycardo. Jill was one of our kids from back when you were coaching high school students. Now we still do, but before we were coaching like one particular institution, and Jill just so happens to be one of the very first kids that I've trained, so it's
Hmm.
a full circle moment for me right now.
And then Jill joined us as well as all the fabulous publicity we've had in our even our podcast cover that you see right now, our different tournaments in the past. Jill single-handedly created the brand of Debatable and now they are here in the podcast being interviewed. So, hi Jill, how are you?
I'm very excited to be featured in Debatable. So yeah, happy
All right.
about this.
Kyle specifically requested you for religion, and I know this is like a conversation you and Kyle always have that I cannot really relate to. Not because I dislike religion, I just do not understand it in the same way you guys do. So I want to know, like Jill, how did you end up being interested in the theme of religion?
I think the interest in religion comes primarily from my background, both as like a person and as someone that came from an all girls Catholic school. So there are particular nuances with the education that I've come from and still am, because I'm also in a university that's also Catholic oriented, but relatively liberal compared to when I was in high school and grade school. I'll focus more on the Catholic school, high school part and the all girls school part, because the way that religion, particularly Catholic, Roman Catechism, was being taught to us was very, how do I say this? Very enforced. Like in every step in which we had different discussions for different subjects, you had professors or you had teachers that reinforce certain values or that would end up trying to connect their discussions to a religious belief or to a certain religious practice. Every time students would participate in social issues, whether that's on social media or even here in the campus that you're in, sometimes the admins would step in by talking about how we need to regulate our discussions in a way that lives out certain Catholic values. I had a batchmate who got pregnant, and the way that the school approached the issue was they started to show us documentaries of old abortions that would essentially discuss how abortion was just generally bad, both in the faith aspect of it, but as well as in a way that you can't stomach it. Like it was an entire documentary about how abortions were done back then. By the end of that video, by the end of that documentary, almost everyone in the class, inclusive of myself, were crying about it because it was just that visceral and graphic. So yeah, the TLDR to that, my interest in religion comes from, I guess, trauma from high school and from grade school. Yeah.
Yeah, I think everyone has like a different relationship with religion. Like I also went to an all girls Catholic school. I would say my experience was a little different. Like of course religious trauma will always exist, right? But I think everyone has a different relationship with spirituality. Kyle has a very positive one. I'm like meh, right? As you mentioned, you are on a more extreme end of a spectrum. So I'm very interested to get into the motions that you've provided for the tournament, right? The first one being about like how we perceive or how religion frames like suffering, right? So the motion reads, this house prefers a world where religions frame suffering as a collective test from God rather than being sourced from individual desires. So there's an info slide for this. We are going to put it in the description. But I also, I guess, to start, right? What was the main inspiration for this motion?
The main inspiration for this motion, I guess, in short few words, is existential dread. I think at some point when people start questioning their spirituality and their religion, they end up fundamentally starting with, why is this happening to me? Like they probably are going through something. And usually it starts out with a discussion about how vulnerable you are feeling, and whether or not God is there to help you get out of your situation of suffering or existentialism. So the emotions inspired from those types of discussions where you question whether or not the reason why you are experiencing suffering or something painful or going through a lot is because of the consequences of your own actions, or is it because the universe is just stacked against you? And by extension, something that God allowed it to be. Because I think there's a lot of narratives that talk about how we perceive suffering, and sometimes it's usually sourced from, you are probably a sinner, and the reason why you are continuously suffering is either because of karma, either because of these are the consequences of your own actions. But religions, or at least the way that religious rhetoric works, doesn't allow you to really question why you're even experiencing these consequences in the first place, especially if there's a recognition that this higher being or this higher power can control to some extent the fate that you are experiencing or the way that your life is unraveling. So, yeah, it comes from those types of questions that you have, especially when you're doubtful of your existence and by extension, your relationship with God.
Oh, you mentioned karma, and I found that it was very interesting to me because you mentioned that suffering can be seen as sourced from individual desires. That's a very Buddhist kind of thinking where you're saying that, the root of all suffering is desire. On the other hand, you have this very Christian notion, perhaps an Abrahamic notion of suffering from the book of Job, where suffering in that context was, can a person's faith be strengthened through the ordeals that they are facing? So I think it's very interesting from a philosophy perspective already, but considering the wording of this motion is about preferring one world over the other, I imagine that the debate should be about what kind of world would this be, right? Like, how would this affect people's relationships? How would this affect,
Yeah.
like people's relationships with themselves and with others, perhaps even the state or society, stuff like that. So I want to ask you, how do you imagine these kinds of discussions in the context of a debate? Like the all these impacts, how do you imagine them being run ideally?
Firstly, I think it needs to be clear from the onset in like the first speaker exchange what your metrics for preferring a world are. And I think this is probably where debaters are going to struggle, because there's a tendency with this house prefers a world motions where debaters will go straight into discussing the impacts of what is good, what is bad about this new world, and by extension, what is good and what is bad about status quo. And I think the first way to reconcile all those impacts, because I think it's pretty clear what you can derive from when you try to frame these things like suffering, whether that's an individualistic endeavor or if this is something that you can end up attributing to God or whatever the higher power is giving to you. I think the way that you need to frame it first when you're talking about the metrics to prefer, I think there needs to be two levels. One, in terms of the perspective of the individual person who is probably following these religious beliefs, like how do religious believers, what are their interests, why would they prefer something over the other, and and then the second level is in terms of what would the society look like, and it becomes a metric of preference in the sense, would this better society given that this compels people to act in specific manners. The point at which those metrics are clear, I think a lot of the discussions then revolve around, on the first level, how do you want to frame the discussion of collective test from God, or a collective test from God, rather? So you can frame it as something that God has given to you. Like, you know how the saying, God gives his hardest test to his strongest soldiers. So you can
Oh
frame
yeah,
it
the
like that.
meme.
Yeah, the name, God, I am not your strongest soldier. Yeah. So you can frame it in that manner where God believes in you, that the higher power knows that they're giving you difficult challenges, and they also know that you are capacitated to be able to overcome them. And maybe as a religious believer, that's something that empowers you because you know that God wouldn't give you something that you can't overcome. And that's a very empowering narrative that either makes you persevere through all this suffering and so much pain, and just essentially talking about what the importance of that is. But when it comes to the discussion of the collective, like in terms of what this means for society, in terms of implications there, I think there's room for opposition to question how you might also have to consider that not everyone might perceive this as an empowering narrative. I think at the point in which you have this type of world that frames religion or frames suffering as something that is a test by God, you have people who question why they're even being tested by God in the first place. You have people who might feel overwhelmed with the fact that God is testing them with trauma left and right, with all these experiences. And that's probably going to lead to a world that is either more, how do I say this, more less religious, or at least would be more likely to turn away from these religious discussions. And then the question then becomes, is that a world that we want in the first place? Or if it's okay to even have a less religious world. Like, to be fair, in status quo, and I think this is where you engage with the comparative coming from pop, you already have trends from history where people are extremely religious, but over time, depending on the shape of the political landscape or the climate of a specific society, sometimes people deviate from religion because they have other priorities. They'd rather focus on individualistic endeavors, given that their sufferings or their choices, the suffering that they experience is something that they've been told is a consequence of their own actions. So maybe this is something where people are more likely to be accountable about their actions, more accountable about what they're doing, and therefore more incentivized to either change themselves. But of course, that always depends. I think it exists in extents. Even if it's a this house prefers a world motion, I think there is a way or space for both teams to claim that the same benefits exist on both sides. The question then becomes, to what extent do these benefits or these impacts manifest, given the way that one of our primary institutions that people are introduced to? Because you know how, like, family is the first institution that you are introduced to as a child, that helps you introduce you to the rest of the world. Religion is also another primary institution that helps you socialize with different experiences, and by extension also is a mechanism that can change the way that you actualize and rationalize your experiences. So I imagine the discussion to go into different directions, whether that's in the formative years, whether that's just trying to prove the extent of which something that can exist on both sides will manifest greater or less.
Yeah, I think what was interesting there was, it really affects how people behave, right? Like, if you know you are being tested, it might strengthen your resolve, as you mentioned. Or if you know that it might be, or you think that it might be because of your own actions, then you kind of police yourself a bit more. So that's like one of the clashes, right? Like, what do you imagine the debate looking like when it comes to not how people act, but how people, either they have hope in an afterlife, or like how they view themselves now? Because I think a big chunk of this debate is also the idea that, religion exists to sort of comfort us, right? Is there an angle here where you can argue on either side that actually we make people feel worse about themselves?
Definitely. I think the discussion about people feeling worse about themselves comes as, like, the way that I'm perceiving it right now is opposition criticizing government on this new world. Because even if you have a specific way that religions frame it to make it seem empowering that you can overcome the test of God, not all problems that are perceived as a test of God are things that you can easily triumph as an individual. And this is where opposition can talk about systematic problems where poor people, POCs, other minority individuals and identities who cannot overcome things like racism, who can't easily overcome things like their lands being taken away from them, or as a woman, you can't overcome the fact that you are being sexualized or objectified by the rest of society, or you are surrounded with people that make you feel unsafe. The fact that you frame that problem as something that God is testing you with is one, I think that damages an individual's capacity to form a relationship with God, which is something that I mentioned earlier. Like, why is God testing me on these things? But two, I think if this is a person who has already experienced such, like, if the suffering that they experience is so extensive, so traumatic, or in a way that is framed by either teams that is just generally difficult to overcome, because when you consider suffering and the way that people experience the phenomena of life, it's never in a vacuum. You don't just have one form of pain or one form of suffering. You have multitudes of it that end up stacking up and that stresses you out, that essentially either makes you a better person, but it could also break you down in the process, which by extension makes it difficult for you to tackle the other problems that exist on your list or that exist as you are continuing living on. I think in that regard, a person who has intersecting problems, intersecting forms of suffering and pain, is likely to be the most vulnerable in this new world where you frame it as a collective test from God, because now they can't just easily say that this is a systematic problem that is being a systematic problem that they need to fix, or that can be accounted for because of the actions of other people or because of the selfish desires of greedy corporations or greedy CEOs or corrupt politicians. But instead, it's something that they are just forced to deal with because God says it so. And I think this is where people just genuinely feel hopeless, because if it is not necessarily the reason, if their suffering is not caused by these individuals and it is the God that they're supposedly um who's testing them. God is supposedly the person that you seek comfort from in these times of vulnerabilities. And I think there's a disconnect or a disjunct when people are seeking comfort from a God that is supposed to save them, but at the same time is the main cause of their suffering. So, kind of like a cognitive dissonance. I think that's a beautiful discussion should it come out from opposition.
Yeah, I think that the motion itself can talk about so many different things. Like, I intentionally didn't ask a lot of questions about like the philosophy of it all because we're gonna be here all night. But I think it's particularly interesting because this motion is about an individual's relationship to the world around them as informed by religion.
And like what role like the institutions have in like shaping that, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a really nice analog or parallel to the second motion, which is super different. It's about the other end of that spectrum or the other side of that coin, where it's about the institution that is organized religion. So the second motion is this house believes that the Catholic Church should abandon the dogma of papal infallibility. And I know for a fact that this is something that has been used like politically. We can look at a religious institution like the Catholic Church as an organization, and because it's an organization, it is not invulnerable. Tama ba? It is not immune
Yeah.
to politics, right? So I know that papal infallibility over the years, it does have like a theological or religious basis or justification. This idea from Jesus when he told Peter that whatever you hold true on earth, I'll hold true in heaven. But I also know that the reason why that was such a big thing was because in the early stages of the church, there were so many conflicting ideas of what Jesus wanted. And so
Yeah.
the Pope originally was just like this big brained individual, like so good, could settle all the debates. And that's where, like, I think politically, that's where the concept of papal infallibility came in. So now we're trying to assess whether that's still worth having. So, Jill, I wanted to ask your thoughts on this from the perspective of Gov. How do you think Gov should go about framing the needs or the interests of the Catholic Church at this time to the point that they might consider abandoning the dogma that is papal infallibility?
The current landscape of political discussions in context of religion have turned or evolved themselves in a way that is more skeptical of the authority of, in this specific motion, at least the Catholic Church. So you have people questioning why you still promote scriptures like the wives of men have to be subservient to them when they get married, or even just the way that religion is weaponized against other individuals in political issues. So, for example, in the case of abortion, a lot of religious believers, the way that they argue against abortion is because it's against the Ten Commandments. So, I think the evolution of our social political landscape has turned it has evolved in a way that integrates the religious discussions and religious institutions such as the Catholic Church being actively involved in those political discussions, either making statements about it, either different priests, different people in authority of these institutions making comments about it, making homilies. And it's very interesting because there's a question there of whether we ought to hold these individuals accountable or whether or not we should blindly believe in these church leaders in the way that they intervene in political discussions. And that's where papal infallibility is sort of, at least in this context of the motion, is sort of revolved around, in the sense that the Catholic Church has the incentive to participate in political discussions, given that they also have their own political agendas, such as being able to evangelize more people being empathetic to their religious members and the like, or them just being able to gain traction and things like protection from states, protection from individuals on the ground. And the fact that there are people that are turning away from the Catholic Church because either they do not like the fact that the Catholic Church tries to portray themselves as absolute at the point in which they participate in political discussions, such as the usage of papal infallibility. And that's where the bit of the motion slide, the info slide comes in on the Pope essentially ruling that the Catholic Church should not change whether or not women can be ordained as priests. Like, essentially, the Gov case from there is just discussing what the political agendas of the Catholic Church are given the context, the existing status quo context of political discussions. So you have more people turning away from religion, more people mocking the Catholic Church every time that they participate in political discourse, either because the way that the Catholic Church tries to argue their claims is based on religious ideology or religious faith that that can be perceived as questionable, but no one really questions it because the leaders that propagate these types of narratives are not allowed to be questioned, or at least there's a narrative that legitimizes that whatever they say is actually true or actually like it's just infallible. I'm sorry for the lack of words. So this point in time, I think the Catholic Church has already shifted their priorities. Because the reason why you established papal infallibility in the first place was the church was at the point in which it was still at the point in history where they were trying to figure out which dogmas, which doctrines they wanted to put into practice, and how specifically they wanted to portray certain morals in the morals given the stories in the Bible, given the doctrines that are already written or that they wrote themselves with apostolic letters and the like. And that's that point in history in order for them to establish themselves as a legitimate authority that would narrate how morals and faith ought to be. But now in status quo, the church is no longer perceived as someone that has the moral ascendancy to dictate what morals ought to look like, when their perception or their rulings and their view or perspective on political discussions, and by extension, the lived experiences of different minorities, different individuals, is either disconnected from those experiences or is something that is considered to be questionable given that existing disconnect. But secondly, it's actively favoring a political perspective or political agenda that people do not like.
I think an important part there is really like building the context, right? Like with the rise of social media, people being more critical of the Catholic Church, it's like I guess it's about adjusting to the times, right? But I was
Yeah,
thinking
yeah, yeah.
if I were an op, right? I would probably have many choices on how to respond. I think my question would be, is it strategic for you to like defend that papal infallibility is something we should still have? Or do you think it's more strategic for opposition to just focus on, without it, things will get worse? Now, I know, like, and we always say this to, like, when we were coaching you and people we coach now, and I'm sure you also promote this, like, you can do both, right? But I think a lot of debaters ask, which do you prioritize? Do you think, therefore, we should defend what the church has been doing, or do we take like the more counterfactual route of just pointing out like things will get worse if anyone can interpret things the way they want?
When you consider the strategic implications of the op case or the op responses, personally, like the way that you choose which to prioritize depends on what Gov does in the round. My personal take on it is go for the route of why it's unnecessary, why it is not as urgent, and why it is not as effective if you want to abandon this dogma. And that's like sort of a template that I also tell my kids on whenever they discuss abandoned debates and policy debates. Because even though this is worded as a this house believes that debate, it's also kind of like a pseudo policy debate, given that you're asking that the political actor should do a particular policy or do a political action, which is abandoning the dogma. So I think opposition strategy here is to discuss first, debunk how government's discussion about the status quo, about why times have changed and that's why we need to adjust to it and therefore abandon dogma, is a mismatch. Like the justifications that they have is not matched with the action that they're taking. So that's the first strategic point that I think opposition needs to make. And you can do that by discussing why it's not necessary or it's not effective, in the sense that you don't actually get the change that you want coming from government when you abandon this. And then only then after you discuss, only then after you deal with how government is not meeting their win conditions, given that context, do you plug in why papal infallibility is a good thing, given the current times or just in general. Though I would put it more as an extension that comes out from deputy rather than the main priority that comes out from first speaker. The reason why I'd say that if you want to do the latter part where you're explaining why papal infallibility is a good thing, I think when you consider the strategy of debate in and of itself, in reality, people are just trying to win on their own paths to victory. And then they just try to justify why their win conditions are the win conditions of the rest of the debate. So I think first speakers need to, particularly up LO speakers, need to deal with uh, either diminishing the win conditions that come out from government when they try to contextualize the problem, and only then do you extend on why papal infallibility is a good thing coming from deputy, because it's at that point in which your LO deals with the win conditions from gov. Do you have more space as an opposition bench team or as a debater in and of as a debater to forward your own main conditions and explain why that is the most important or why that is the one that makes the most sense and most central to the motion.
I think opposition can, when jumping off what you said, that op can say that it's not something that we need to do, it's not necessary, it's not urgent for us to do. What I remembered in response to that is, I think the idea from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which I read for debate 10 years ago, what I remember is infallibility is enjoyed not just by the Pope, but also by the College of Bishops through the Magisterium, which is basically they're the ones who write the entire like catechism, all the
I think I
dogma.
had to read this too. Like we had a little booklet, but I didn't really read it like in an academic sense. It's just a you thing. Like
I had a debater friend in high school, and he really wanted to be a priest. So
ah.
like before he slept, he would read the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So I'm like, can I borrow, stuff like that.
Okay.
But anyway, so I would say like the College of Bishops acts kind of like a representative democracy as well, right? Like there is a source of infallibility that is not just concentrated in one person. So I think that insofar as this motion is about analyzing the church as a political institution, you can make an analogy where the balance of power, so to speak, between the Pope and the College of Bishops is very similar to what you would expect in a government where there is a balance of power between the executive and the legislative branches of government. So I feel like this is a very interesting motion, and I really hope that people who debated this motion get a sense of like, oh, so it's not just trauma. There's something here. Like I can use this to better understand other aspects of life. But how does it affect the way that you view yourself? Which is my very clumsy way of transitioning to the third motion, which is this house as a religious believer prefers not to perceive God. So in the info slide here, it's about the theory of the face of God, the idea that the existence of God cannot be perceived. And this might be considered something like a mystical experience. Like you experience it, but you can't really explain it to others in a way that they would understand. So here, Jill, what I wanted to ask is for Gov, do you have to defend like you cannot experience God in any way? Or is there like a softer stance that you could take on Gov here?
For this one, I don't think it's Gov's burden to say that you don't experience God in any way. I think it's more on how you frame the experience of God. Because the face of God theory is not to say that you should no longer perceive God as a whole. The actually the proponent of the face of God theory, or the face, is Emmanuel Levinas, who is, I hope I did not butcher his name, who is actually a very prominent religious believer in the Christian faith. So he made an essay about the face of God. The rhetoric is actually quite religious leaning, despite the fact that the theory seems more equipped for those who want to remain irreligious or who don't necessarily want to have a specific stance or look into religion. And as government, I think you can derive similar ways to how he wrote the theory of the face of God, which is to discuss, which is more on a critique about how we frame God's existence in our lives. So the only reason why you have certain beliefs in God, whether or not he's a man that's Middle Eastern, or whether he's a man that's like with blonde hair, blue eyes, or why you think he's like so charitable, he's 6 feet tall, or just other characteristics that are being associated with him, is actually due to social influences that you as an individual are exposed to. And this is because you are exposed to religious communities, or there are religious narratives that are being propagated by social institutions, and that's why you associate certain characteristics with God. So the face of God theory is more of a discussion on how you want to frame that experience with God, and whether you should agree that you should associate certain characteristics that you might have been conditioned to believe in as a young person or as a person that was raised in a religious community. There's also a question on whether that perception that you have of God is actually something that is comforting to you as an individual, like God being part of the Holy Trinity, or God being part of, like, just essentially being associated with human characteristics or characteristics that you want to idealize. Is that something that comforts you as a religious believer? Or would you be more comforted with the fact that you do not necessarily need to associate God with certain characteristics, just the fact that there is a higher power that exists is something that brings you comfort. And the perception of God does not necessarily mean you should no longer believe in God. It's just more about how you frame that experience. And I think coming from government, when you look at it, you can frame it in a way that either if you perceive God with human characteristics or certain characteristics that you want to attribute him to, you can say that that's probably exalting to his existence, assuming that he is truly a transcendent being. But I think the more strategic way coming from government is really just to talk about how you the individual experience of how you rationalize the existence of a higher power in your life. And that's where that perception of God comes in, and how you can still believe in God despite not necessarily perceiving him. You just perceive him in a, I don't want to say perceive, but you experience him in a different form compared to what you were conditioned to believe in.
So this is like a discussion of where is your relationship with religion better, right? I think what I
Yeah,
got from there
yeah.
is there's like a discussion about like which is less insulting to God, assuming that they did exist, and this motion definitely assumes that, right? There's also an angle for Gov here about where you're better comforted, right? I think one thing I would explore probably in Gov is, like we're Filipinos. A lot of our participants are not like blonde, blue-eyed, whatever. And a lot of the common perceptions of God or even Jesus, anyone related to God, is that they look a particular way. My question though is, if you were opposition, I think there is something you might lose, right? By not perceiving God in a particular way. What I want to ask is there anything specific that you feel opposition has to talk about to prove or to show that without attempting to perceive God, your relationship or your understanding of religion might be harmed?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think the fundamental question that opposition needs to run in this type of debate is, why does religion or why does the belief in God even exist in the first place? The reason why you have religious institutions propagating specific narratives on relationship with God or what God looks like is because religions were established as a means for humans to cope with their vulnerabilities in life. Because back then, humans didn't know how to explain why you'd have night and day. They didn't know how to explain or rationalize or how things worked in the universe or why they were even placed on earth and what things like apples or oranges were, and whether or not it's okay that I'm alive but someone else that's close to me is dying. I think the opposition clash from there is just, it is necessary for you to perceive God through different experiences or associate him with all these different characteristics because it is a way that comforts you in your times of doubt, in your times of emotional vulnerability. And that's the exact reason why religions were made in the first place. At the point in which you choose not to perceive God, even if government tries to claim that you are trying to distance yourself from the characteristics that society conditioned you to associate God with, it doesn't change the fact that that now changes your relationship of God, in the sense that, is it all right for you to even depend on God in times of your emotional need because you are trying to not perceive him in the first place? Because you are so scared of reducing his big existence, of transcendency, of divinity. Does that mean that you are now afraid of relying on God when hardships start to come about? And essentially, opposition ought to exploit that necessity of forming those emotional relations, even if it is a mere social construction to the way that you view and believe God, and essentially just argue for the value of why those social constructions and individual constructions that you have of a being that you are not sure exists is so important and relevant to you when it comes to giving you comfort and forms of actualization or catharsis.
I think you mentioned something there that I kind of see an extension for, right? If I were deputy, which is because you are not making it relatable for yourself, I think, right, you also run the risk of isolating yourself from others. For example, if Kyle
Yeah,
has a
yeah, yeah.
different perception, right? Or no perception, I have no perception. Like how do we bond? Like I know Gov can probably argue like there are other ways to bond with when it comes to religion, but
Secular
we
bonding.
can't deny, right, Jill, that people try
Yeah.
to connect based on like, oh, God is like us, like footprints in the
Yeah.
sand. Like how will God make the
Where there was
footprints?
only one set of footprints, that was when he carried you.
Yeah, so I think at upright you can also argue you're not just losing your personal relationship to God, you're also losing or possibly losing it with the community. But Gov here
Yeah.
can say, right, that like who said the community was good anyway? Like if the community is like racist against you and doesn't see you as an image of God, right? Like especially for minorities,
Yeah, I was gonna say,
right?
like,
Like trans
yeah,
individuals,
what am
women.
the
Exactly,
community
exactly.
says? Yeah, the
Yeah.
community says, let's hate on the gays.
Yeah.
Like, is that worth preserving? But yeah, like, I was also going to say something like this, though, because if God is so inconceivable to the human mind, that also means that what God wants could not be perceived or conceived of by the human mind either. So it would be very difficult for like Bible thumpers on Gov's side to go like, yeah, this is what God wants. God wants us to restrict marriage between man and woman. God wants us to not recognize trans people and stuff like
Mm-mm.
that. So I imagine like extension wise, you can make an argument on Gov where you say, well, now we have more space to pursue on our own through secular bonding, more progressive stuff. But I want to pass the question back to you, Jill. Are there other like angles that you can take for either Gov or Op where you can get extensions from potentially?
I just want to do a little comment on what you guys said. Yeah, I completely agree. Like, I think at the point in which you, like, religious believers choose not to perceive God or associate them with certain characteristics, that actually diminishes the extent of authority that religious institutions have when trying to dictate a particular narrative. And by extension, that diminishes their ability to participate in political discussions that try to reframe social issues in a way that is more favorable to them. Yeah, that was just my added bit. For other extensions, I think like the other extensions that I have here, if it's beyond the discussions that we just had earlier, I think on golf you can talk about how you take the worst case that comes out from opposition, where you feel disconnected from God. Say that's actually a good thing because given the way that you have been raised to believe that God has essentially intervened with a lot of the universe. Probably the reason of why you're suffering, or at least allowed you to suffer because he allowed you to make certain decisions, and you're just merely suffering on the consequences of the actions that he allowed you to do. I think your disconnection with how you perceive your relationship with God, or your disconnection with God as a whole, I think liberates you when it comes to the way that you see the world. You're no longer bounded to the scriptures. You're no longer bounded to it doesn't just exist on that political agenda discussion about minorities, our like progressive values. But I think this actually works in favor as well as on the personal level, like what makes life meaningful to you, what gives you hope. Because now meaning, things like hope are no longer sourced from a figure that you once idealized as a religious believer, but instead your religiosity and your spirituality refocuses the way that you look at things like meaning and hope to a more internal self type of thing. Because when you perceive God in status quo, when you're trying to actualize things like meaning, you usually depend on him in the sense like, oh, maybe I was born in this world to be as charitable as God. Or perhaps I was born in this world to receive and give love to others because I'm surrounded and blessed with all these different people who love me just the same. But you always attribute it to God versus attributing it to yourself or to other people. And I think as Gov Bench, your extension there is just how you better form relationships with other people, because now you're not necessarily grateful to a higher power that gives you all these blessings, but you're grateful for the people who just exist in your life that you end up choosing to involve in, kind of thing. Like the way that I just imagine that extension coming from government is just more on an individual aspect of how you look at your life. Other than those extensions of like the social implications and the perception, the relationship that you have with God, and by extension, the rest of others, I'm kind of thinking, my thinking right now is dry. But like, if you have more questions, maybe we can find more extensions. But those were the three main things that I was thinking about when I was making this motion.
All right, thank you very much. I think what I'm getting from this, right, like as someone who is not as into religion, is that there seems to be like common themes, right? Like, why is religion there? What is our relationship to it? And like, Jill, in the future, we're probably gonna invite you again for like a full blown episode just talking about how to deal with religion motions. I think it's a very intimidating topic for a lot of people, probably because, it's a very controversial thing to disagree with or agree with or to try to make arguments for. So thank you very much for, giving us a lot of things to talk about, think about, debate about. And like, thank you for the post debate analysis. This is always super helpful for people who, like my biggest gripe in debate in like Asians format when there's veto is that I don't get to talk about everything. So this is like Canada just really made this podcast as an excuse to talk about all the motions we can't debate ourselves. So thank you for being a part of that, Jill.
Thank you for having me. And super excited. I hope Debatable goes well. The Debatable tournament goes well. And super excited to hear what people end up running in the tournament.
Yeah, we're gonna update you if we hear anything interesting. So there you have it, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in to this post debate analysis. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye bye.